Hi, everyone. We're going to get started. Welcome to this Manhattan Arts Grants information session. Thank you for joining us. My name is Laura Liscano. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Program Associate in the Artist Services Department at LMCC. I am a Latina woman wearing a white shirt with a blurry background of the LMCC office, and I am presenting from the ancestral land of the Lenape, which is known as New York City today. I also want to introduce my colleague who will be co-leading today's session.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Lina Alfonso, she, ella pronouns. I'm the Director of Artist Services at LMCC. I'm also a Latina woman. I'm wearing a black and white polka dot shirt with a blurred background. I have curly hair, blondish, and I'm presenting from the ancestral land and current island of Pagank in Lenape-Hoking, also known as Governor's Island.
Thanks, Lina. And also with us today is Emerson Chang, Program Manager in Artist Services, who is joining us to provide tech support throughout this evening's session. Now, I would like to share a few accessibility notes about our information session. Live captioning and ASL interpretation are available for this session. In order to activate captions, please locate the menu bar at the bottom of your screen and click on Show Captions. This will open a menu in which you can select the language for your captions. We do recommend English, as this session will be carried out in English. You'll also see that you have the option to change the size of your captions by going into the subtitle settings. I would also like to introduce Erica and Mark Weisglass, who are providing sign language interpretation for the session. We recommend using the gallery view to ensure that both the speaker and the interpreters are visible at all times. You can also pin their videos by clicking on the blue dots in the upper right-hand corner of their video window and clicking Pin Video. And for extra security precautions, you will notice that right now you cannot rename yourself or unmute your microphone. We will have dedicated moments for questions throughout the meeting and a Q&A session at the end, where we will be sure to facilitate verbal interactions. If anyone wants to join a Q&A session with ASL interpretation, please let Emerson know via the chat so we can coordinate that for you. And to ask questions throughout the meeting, please use the chat function to drop a question. We will take questions in the order we receive them during the designated sections for questions. So those are just a few notes on accessibility today. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our community partners for tonight's information session. We are grateful to be joined by the New York City Arts and Education Roundtable and Community Word Project. Thank you so much to both organizations for spreading the word about tonight's session and for your support in making it happen. And I'm now excited to invite Alex Latorre, Operations Manager at the Roundtable, to share a few words. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you so much, Laura. Like Laura said, my name is Alex Latorre. I use she, her pronouns. I am also a Latina woman. I'm wearing wire-framed glasses, a gold t-shirt, and I have my dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. And today I am calling in from the ancestral land of the Lenape people, also known as New Jersey. So thank you all for joining us today. We are thrilled to co-host this session with LMCC and Community Word. So I'm just here to say a couple of quick words about the Roundtable. We are a grassroots service organization working to improve and advance the state of arts education through professional development workshops, advocacy, and online resources and platforms to connect the arts education field. We are a member and community-driven organization. So I'll mention a couple of things about some upcoming opportunities, and then I'll pass it back to Laura. Many of you may know the Roundtable from past re-granting opportunities, such as our Teaching Artist Mentorship Program, or the Arts Educator Emergency Relief Fund, but we also host multiple standalone professional development workshops and open spaces throughout the year. This September, we'll be hosting our 4th annual Black Women's Wellness Retreat, and we are coming up on our 10th day of learning on equity and inclusion on October 1st, which will be hosted at the Jamaica Center for Arts and Learning in Queens. More information will be announced on that event soon. And our annual flagship event is the Face-to-Face Arts and Education Conference, which will be taking place again next year in April of 2025 at the City College of New York. I am thrilled to share that we recently announced the request for proposals for the 2025 Face-to-Face Conference. So if you're interested in proposing a workshop or a panel for the conference, you can learn more about that at the link that I just dropped in the chat. Deadline for those proposals is in September. Conference will have opportunities for both virtual and in-person presentations, and all presenters will receive a paid honorarium in addition to the full conference registration. If anything I've mentioned today is of interest to you and you want to receive announcements about upcoming opportunities or events that we are hosting and stay connected with us, you can join our email list. And you can do that by visiting the homepage of our website, which I just linked in the chat, and scroll down to be added to that list. On our website, you'll also find our robust resource library, updates and news items from the field, as well as our free jobs board for arts education job opportunities. So that's all from me for now. If you have any questions about the work of the roundtable, you can feel free to reach out to me. Again, I am Alex Latore, the operations manager for the roundtable, and I just put my email address in the chat. So looking forward to hearing from you and excited to have co-hosted this session.
Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you for joining us. And now I would also like to introduce Dale Novella Anderson Lee, who is the co-director Teaching Artist Project, to share a few words about the Community Word Project.
Hello, thank you, Lara. My name, once again, is Dale Novella Anderson Lee, she, her, hers. I'm joining you today from the part of Lenape-Hoking that we currently call Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. And I am a Black woman with caramel skin and matching locks, shoulder-length locks. I'm wearing glasses today, and I have virtual lipstick on because I didn't feel like putting on real lipstick. So a little bit about Community Word Project. One, I would like to thank LMCC for being a partner with us, and we've enjoyed a partnership with them for several years, and we have several alumni and teaching artists that have received this grant, so we're very happy to continue our relationship with them. CWP has been around for about 25 years, and we put 2 teaching artists in classrooms all over New York City to teach social justice through the arts and teach the power of voice. Specifically, my program, the Teaching Artist Project, we train artists to incorporate social justice and social emotional learning into their arts curriculums. And we are a tuition-based program that runs 8 months out of the year, starting in October, but we do also have public workshops that we co-facilitate with our partners, including the Arts and Education Roundtable. And we also do a job fair with the Arts and Education Roundtable every May that can bring together over 400 different teaching artists to meet 30 to 50 arts organizations that are hiring teaching artists. And we love to support our community that way. Yeah, I'm happy to be here, happy to be a part of the community. If any of these programs sound good to you, I am going to put our website in the chat and our email. Our applications for many of our programs, we even have a program in Rochester, and that is open currently. And please follow us on Instagram. Let us know what you think. Reach out if you have any questions at tap@communitywordproject.org. Yeah, and thank you once again. I'll throw it back to Lada.
Great. Thank you so much, Dale. And thank you both to being here with us today and for joining us, and again for helping to spread the word about this information session and our programs. Wonderful. So let's get started. Before I talk us through today's agenda, I want to quickly share a bit more about LMCC as an organization for those of you who may be less familiar with us. The Lower Manhattan Cultural Council, or LMCC, was founded in 1973 in the financial district on the belief that arts and artists are vital to communities throughout New York City. And today, LMCC serves as the Cultural Council for the Borough of Manhattan. We do this through artist residencies, grant funding, which is what we will be talking about today, and free cultural events. At LMCC, our team is part of the Artist Services Department, which administers the 3 Manhattan Arts Grants programs, LMCC's residency programs, and the Creative Aging program, Sukasa, which places individual artists at senior centers in Manhattan to carry out learning projects for older adults from January through June 2025. The open call for the Sukasa program is also live right now with an application deadline of September 10th, 2024. We are not going to be talking about the Sukasa program today, but you can join a dedicated information session on the Sukasa program on Tuesday, July 30th at 6 p.m. via Zoom. You can find more information about all of our programs and to register for that information session for Sukasa at lmcc.net or by subscribing to our newsletter. So that's just a little bit about LMCC. And so now let's go over the agenda for today's meeting. So today we will be providing an in-depth overview of LMCC's grant programs. Those are CreativeEngagement, UMEZ Arts Engagement, and CreativeLearning. We will start with the overall goals of LMCC's grant programs. Then we will talk about who you are as an applicant and what funding sources you may be eligible for. We will talk about the key differences you want to pay attention to as you are deciding which grant program is most appropriate for your project. We'll then take a look at the review process and the evaluation criteria for each program. We'll provide a brief overview of the online application form itself, and we will share important tips to keep in mind as you start your application. And finally, we will take a look at the timeline for hearing back. We ask that you please stay for the whole session today. We'll be together for about 2 hours with questions. I know the session is a little long, but it is comprehensive. And our goal in this session is to help you understand the programs and their eligibility requirements. We'll also share a few pieces of advice to help you strengthen your proposals. And afterwards, you'll want to make sure you read through the full program guidelines for all eligibility requirements. And you'll also want to visit the online application form to familiarize yourself with the components of the application. And throughout the session today, we will be referencing program resources and links that you'll need as you start working on your applications. All of these links are available on our website and will be sent to you in a follow-up email on Monday. Now, if you are calling in over the phone today, please make sure to email creativeengagement@lmcc.net, letting us know that you called into today's session so we can email these materials to you. Otherwise, we don't have your email and we won't be able to share those materials with you. Now, before we start talking about the grant programs, I want to share 2 important things with you. The first is that the application deadline is Tuesday, September 10th, 2024 at 5 p.m. I recommended that you write it down on your calendars and circle it. This is the deadline you must submit your application by. There are no extensions, so we again recommend that you write it down. And this is also the application deadline for the Sukasa program for those of you who are interested in that program. And the second piece is that on the screen, you will find LMCC's email and phone contact information. Please do use this information to get in touch with our staff for any questions you may have during the application process. Lena has also dropped it in the chat. We do highly encourage you to contact us well ahead of the deadline, as our time does become more limited the closer we are to the application deadline. Great, so that's it for me for now. I'll now pass it to Lena, who will share more about LMCC's grant programs and the goals of each program.
Great. Thank you, Laura. Great. So I'm going to begin with a quick overview of LMCC as a funder and the programs. The first thing to know is that LMCC as a funding organization is re-granting or redistributing funds from public and private agencies with the goal of expanding access to funds that are otherwise not available to individuals, collectives, and organizations. And so for the Manhattan Arts Grants, LMCC is re-granting funds from 4 agencies. The city, with funding provided by the Department of Cultural Affairs, on the state level with funding provided by the New York State Council on the Arts, the Howard Gilman Foundation, and the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone, or UMEZ. And LMCC distributes the funds from these 4 agencies through the Manhattan Arts Grants, which is the umbrella term for the 3 individual grant programs that Laura has already mentioned: UMEZ Arts Engagement, Creative Engagement, and CreativeLearning. LMCC distributes these funds for the borough of Manhattan, which means that we are unable to consider applicants that are based in other boroughs or for project activities in other boroughs. So if you live or are based in another borough, please contact your local borough arts council to receive information on their programs for you and your project. So that's a bit of information about LMCC as a re-granting organization. Now, going back to the Manhattan Arts Grants and our 3 programs, UMEZ Arts Engagement, Creative Engagement, and CreativeLearning, I want to walk us through a quick overview of the programmatic focus, funding sources available, and grant amounts for each program, so you can start getting a sense of which program is best for you and your project. So starting with UMEZ Arts Engagement. UMEZ Arts Engagement provides grants for arts presentations and programming in any discipline anywhere in Upper Manhattan. For the UMEZ Arts Engagement program, the applicant and project must be based in Upper Manhattan, which is defined as north of 98th Street on the east side of 5th Avenue and north of 110th Street on the west side of 5th Avenue. And for the UMEZ Arts Engagement program, LMCC is re-granting funds from the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone and will award grants of up to $5,000. Now, for Creative Engagement, this program provides grants for arts events and programming in any discipline anywhere in the borough of Manhattan. For Creative Engagement, applicants and projects must be based in the borough of Manhattan. And for Creative Engagement, LMCC will be re-granting funds from the city, the state, and the Howard Gilman Foundation, and will award grants in set amounts of $4,000, $8,000, and $12,000. Now, finally, CreativeLearning. So CreativeLearning provides grants for community arts education and participatory art making projects in any discipline, anywhere in the borough of Manhattan, and specifically for older adults. For CreativeLearning, applicants and projects must be based anywhere in the borough of Manhattan, so similar to Creative Engagement. And for CreativeLearning, LMCC will be re-granting funds from the city and the state. So award grants in CreativeLearning will be in set amounts of $4,000 and $8,000. For those of you who may be familiar already with CreativeLearning or have applied to CreativeLearning, you will notice that this year, CreativeLearning is only supporting programming for older adults. And we're going to talk more about that later in the session, but we do want you to be aware of this change from the beginning. And for all of these 3 grant programs, UMEZ Arts Engagement, Creative Engagement, and Creative Learning, project activities must take place between January 1st and December 31st of 2025. So anytime within the 2025 calendar year. Now, both Creative Engagement and Creative Learning are funded by the city and the state. This means that you can only apply to one program, either Creative Engagement or Creative Learning. You cannot apply to both programs, even if it is for different projects. Creative Engagement and UMEZ Arts Engagement, on the other hand, have similar goals in the kinds of arts programming that they support, and they do have different funders. So for UMEZ Arts Engagement and Creative Engagement, you can apply to both programs for the same project using the same application form, and you could be considered for a maximum award amount of $16,000, as long as you meet all the eligibility requirements of each funder, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But that's just a quick overview of the programmatic focus for Creative Engagement, Creative Learning, and UMEZ Arts Engagement, the funding agencies behind each program, and the maximum grant amounts available through each program. We will share more details and information about the kinds of projects that we can support through Creative Engagement, Creative Learning, and UMEZ Arts Engagement later in the session. But first, I want to talk about the re-grant budget for 2025 and how LMCC determines grant amounts. So for 2025, LMCC is estimating a re-grant budget of around $1.5 million. And we will re-grant these big bucket of money in set amounts of $4,000 or $5,000 in the case of UMEZ Arts Engagement, $8,000, $12,000, and $16,000, depending on which funding sources each applicant is eligible for. So LMCC will consider all applicants for the maximum grant amount possible. And this grant amount will depend on 3 things. It will depend on the program that you apply to. It will depend on how many funding sources you're eligible for. And it will also depend on the size of your project budget expenses. What this means is that the more funding sources you're eligible for, the better your chance of receiving a larger grant award. But keep in mind that the ultimate funding amounts will also depend on the jury's assessment on your proposal, which we will also talk about later in the session. It will depend on the volume of applications received, and then finally on the amount of funding that we receive from the different agencies, Department of Cultural Affairs, New York State Council on the Arts, Howard Gilman Foundation, and the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone. So funding at the maximum eligible amount is not guaranteed. However, if awarded, you will receive no less than $4,000. That will be the minimum grant amount for our programs. Great, so that's just the re-grant budget and grant amounts. But I don't want you to worry about this just yet. We're gonna share a little bit more information to put all of this into context, and so you can leave today well-informed about what you can apply to and how much funding you could potentially be considered for. So you may be thinking, so what should I do now? What should I apply to? So to help you understand which program you should apply to and for which funding sources, we will first talk about who you are as an applicant and the eligibility requirements you must meet to access city, state, Gilman, and UMEZ funds. Once we've talked about you and the eligibility requirements, we will talk about the kinds of projects Creative Engagement, Creative Learning, and UMEZ Arts Engagement are designed to support. So the goal here is to first understand if you are eligible to apply to LMCC and which funding sources you can access, to then think about what's the best grant program for you and your project. So that said, let's start talking about applicants for LMCC's programs. The first thing to know is that to apply to LMCC, there are 3 types of applicants. It can be nonprofit organizations, individual artists, and collectives, which includes project-based collaborations, unincorporated groups, or groups working with or without a fiscal sponsor. Knowing which type of applicant you are is important, as the eligibility requirements for each of the available funding sources are a little bit different for individuals and collectives and organizations. So I'm going to go through the eligibility requirements for each applicant type to access city, state, Gilman, and UMEZ funds. And we're going to start with the individuals and collectives, and we'll talk about organizations in just a moment. So starting with individuals and collectives. You will apply as an individual artist if you are an individual who is applying to present your own work or the work of others. So that will be as an individual artist. Now for collectives, project-based collaborations, including unincorporated groups and groups with a fiscal sponsor, you will apply as an individual on behalf of a group. This means that you must designate a lead artist who will be responsible for applying on behalf of the group as an individual artist. This lead artist must meet all of the individual artist requirements, and then the lead artist must also have a primary directorial role or a decision-making role in the project and be responsible for all of the communications and management of the award if you are given a grant. Okay, so then as an individual or a lead of a collective, let's look at the requirements you must meet to access each funding source. And remember that you may be eligible for up to 4 funding sources for the same project. So let's talk about city funds first. So for city funds, individuals or leads on behalf of a collective only need to reside or have a permanent workspace in Manhattan. That's it. That's the only requirement. This means that if you are an artist that is living or has a permanent workspace in Manhattan, you are eligible for at least 1 funding source, which is city funds. Very simple. The second funding source is state funds. So for state funds, in addition to being based in Manhattan, you must be working with a partner organization as a collaborator in your project. And this organization must be a nonprofit organization, a primary project collaborator, so they're contributing money or other kinds of resources for the project, such as facilities, materials, and marketing support. These organizations should be based in Manhattan, and you or your partner organization cannot have applied to NISCA for a grant for FY25. This means that your partner organization cannot be NIFA, the Field, Fracture Atlas, or any other organization that already applied to NISCA for their own funding. So those are the requirements for state funds as individuals or leads of collective. Moving on to Gilman funds. So for Gilman funds, in addition to being based in Manhattan, you must apply with a non-arts education performing arts project. So that is a dance, music, theater, or multidisciplinary performing arts project. And that's it. Those are the requirements for Gilman funds. Now, finally, for UMEZ funds. So for UMEZ funds, you as an individual or lead on behalf of a collective must reside in Upper Manhattan, which again, that's defined as north of 98th Street on the east side of Fifth Avenue and north of 110th Street on the west side of Fifth Avenue. Additionally, you must have a history of arts programming in 2 calendar years between 2020 and 2024. So those are the requirements as an individual or lead of a collective to access UMEZ funds. Now, relevant to all of the 4 funding sources, Keep in mind that individuals may not apply or receive funds on behalf of an organization to apply to LMCC. So this means that a nonprofit organization that is based outside of Manhattan or does not meet the eligibility requirements cannot apply to LMCC by using your address in Manhattan or a staff address in Manhattan. The organization must meet the requirements in order to apply in that case. So those are all of the requirements that you must know about each funding source if you're an individual artist or lead of a collective. We know this is a lot of information, so we want to do a small and brief exercise to put all of this into context. So we're going to look at a fictional example of what it takes for an individual or lead of a group to be eligible for the 4 available funding sources, so city, state, Gilman, and UMEZ funds. So for this fictional example, we have an individual artist, let's call them Jay, who is a choreographer and dancer who lives in Harlem and is proposing a dance performance at the Jackie Robinson Park. The project will be presented in collaboration with Dance Manhattan, Inc., a fictional nonprofit organization that is based in Manhattan. And then finally, our fictional applicant is estimating a total project expense of $18,000. So now we're going to go through the eligibility requirements for each funding source for Jay and their project. Starting with city funds. So for city funds, we know that Jay lives in Manhattan, and that's the only requirement for city. So that's check mark. Jay is eligible for city funds. Great. For state funds. So for state funds, we know that Jay, in addition to being in Manhattan, they are collaborating with a Manhattan-based nonprofit organization. That organization did not apply to NISCA for FY25. And Jay also did not apply to NISCA for FY25. This means that Jay is also eligible for state funds for that project. So that's state funds. Now moving on to Howard Gilman Foundation. So for Howard Gilman Foundation, we know that Jay's project is a non-arts education performing arts project. So it's a dance project, so that fits the performing arts requirement of Gilman funding. And also Jay is based in Manhattan, so that's it. Jay meets the requirements for Howard Gilman Foundation. So check mark there. Now finally, for UMEZ funds. We know that Jay is based in Upper Manhattan and that the project is also in Upper Manhattan. We know that the project is not an arts education project, right? It's the presentation of a dance performance. And in the application, Jay demonstrated that they have been part of past choreographies in 2023 and 2024. So all of these different pieces of information are showing that Jay is also eligible for UMEZ funds for this fictional project. And so overall, looking at these different pieces of information from this project, we see that Jay will be eligible for the 4 sources of funding, which means that they could apply to both Creative Engagement and UMEZ Arts Engagement for the same project. And because we know from the information provided that the budget in their application shows total costs of $18,000, we can now consider Jay for the maximum grant amount of $16,000 for the proposed project. But what happens if Jay's project were in Lower Manhattan and not in Upper Manhattan? In that case, if the project is in Lower Manhattan, Jay will no longer be eligible for UMEZ funds, which means that Jay would only be eligible for city, state, and Gilman funds. And therefore, the maximum grant amount that they will be considered will be $12,000. So this is just a very brief exercise to help visualize how you can identify which funding sources you could be eligible for, and how being eligible for all four sources of funding would lead to a higher grant amount. We will talk about project expenses later in the session, so I don't want you to worry about that just now. As I want to keep the focus on eligibility for you as an applicant. So all of this information so far has been relevant to individuals and collectives. Now, let's talk about you as an organization. So for those of you who are applying as an organization, the first thing to know is that there are several core eligibility requirements that you must meet to apply to LMCC. First, the organization must be based in Manhattan. Second, the organization must have a proof of nonprofit status, so that is 402 incorporation at the state level or 501c3 at the federal level. And then third, the organization must have a core mission, artistic mission, and or history of arts programming. So those are the core requirements for an organization to apply to LMCC. Now let's look at the additional requirements that the organization should meet in order to access city, state, UMEZ, and Gilman funds. So starting with city funds. So for city funds, as an organization, you must have an operating budget under $100,000 for at least 2 of the last 3 completed fiscal years. For city funds, the organization may not be receiving funds directly from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs for the same fiscal year. So that means that if you already applied to DCLA in June for FY25, you can still apply to LMCC for city funds. Now, if you are awarded funds by DCLA this fall, LMCC will simply withdraw your application for city funds through our programs. But if you do not receive funds from DCLA for FY25, you will still be considered for city funds through LMCC. So we basically serve as a second chance for DCLA money for organizations. Great, so those are the requirements for organizations to access city funds. Let's look at state funds. So for state funds, you as an organization don't have a restriction on your budget size. The organization can have an annual operating budget of any size to apply for state funds. However, the organization may not be directly applying to the New York State Council on the Arts for funding in the same fiscal year. And this is regardless of the funding status. So this means that if you applied to NYSCA for FY25 earlier this month, whether or not you are funded through that application, you cannot apply for state funds through LMCC this year. And those are the requirements for state funds as an organization. Now for Gilman funds. So for Gilman funds, your operating budget as an organization must be below $250,000 for 2 of the last 3 completed fiscal years. The organization must apply with a non-arts education performing arts project. So again, a dance, music, theater, or multidisciplinary performing arts project. And then finally, for Gilman funds, you as an organization may not have received funding directly from the Howard Gilman Foundation for FY25. So those are the requirements for a nonprofit to access Gilman funds. Now, finally, for UMEZ funds. So for UMEZ funds, the nonprofit organization must be based in Upper Manhattan. The organization must be a 501c3 nonprofit organization. So here, a 402 organization is not eligible. Only 501c3 nonprofit organizations are eligible for UMEZ funds. Additionally, the organization must have a core mission of production and or presentation of arts and culture for public audiences, meaning that non-arts organizations are not eligible regardless of a history of presenting arts programming. For UMEZ Arts Engagement, organization must also have an operating budget under $750,000 for 2 of the last 3 completed fiscal years, and the organization must have carried out or participated in publicly accessible arts programming in 2 of the last 5 calendar years, between 2020 and 2024. And then finally, organizations may not be receiving funding from or have a pending application with UMEZ for a grant for the same fiscal year. So those are the requirements for the organization for UMEZ funds. And overall, these are all of the requirements that you as an organization must meet to access city, state, Gilman, and or UMEZ funds. And just as with individual artists, you as an organization may be eligible for 1 or more funding sources. So keep in mind all of these requirements as we continue the conversation today. Now, to put all of this information into context, we're going to do a similar exercise to what we did with individuals. We're going to look at a fictional organization to show how or what are the different ways in which we will assess eligibility for city, state, Gilman, and UMEZ funds. So this fictional organization is called Amazing Theater Group. So Amazing Theater Group is a 501c3 nonprofit organization based in Morningside Heights. The organization has been carrying out a week-long theater festival at Riverside Church for the last 5 years. And they are applying to LMCC for support of that festival taking place in the fall of 2025. Amazing Theater Group's operating budget for the last few years, at least 2 of the last 3 years, has been below $80,000. And then finally, in their application, they're showing that the budget for the festival is $20,000. So in this case, let's break down how Amazing Theaters Group's eligibility would look like for each funding source. Starting with city funds. We know that Amazing Theater Group is based in Manhattan and is presenting a project in Manhattan. So that's great. Manhattan focus is, there. We also know that the operating budget of the organization is below $100,000 for 2 of the last 3 completed fiscal year, which means that they're eligible for city funds because they're also not receiving funding directly from the CLA. So check mark on the different requirements. Amazing Theater Group is eligible for city funds. Let's look at state funds. So for state funds, in addition to being based in Manhattan, having a project in Manhattan, we know this organization is a nonprofit organization and thus has a history of presenting arts programming. And we also know that this organization, Amazing Theater Group, did not submit an application to NISCA for FY25. So that means that this organization is also eligible for state funds. Great. Now let's talk about Howard Gilman. So for Howard Gilman Foundation money, we know that this organization, Amazing Theater Group, is proposing a performing arts program. It's a week-long theater festival. So it meets the requirements for a performing arts project for Howard Gilman. So that's great. And we also know that their annual operating budget is below $250,000 for 2 of the last 3 fiscal years, which means that this organization is also eligible for Howard Gilman Foundation money. Now, finally, for UMEZ funds. So for UMEZ funds, we know that Amazing Theater Group is based in Upper Manhattan and is proposing a project in Upper Manhattan. We also know that they are incorporated as a 501c3 organization, which is a specific requirement of UMEZ, and that their mission is a primary mission of presenting artistic programming. We also know that they have a history of presenting publicly facing work in at least 2 years between 2020 and 2024. So remember, they said that they have been carrying out this festival for the last 5 years. So, checks off that mark for UMEZ Arts Engagement Funds. And finally, we know that these organizations' annual operating budget is below $750,000 for 2 of the last 3 completed fiscal years. So it meets all of the requirements to access UMEZ funds. Now, Amazing Theater Group here is meeting the requirements for all of the funding sources, so city, state, Gilman, and UMEZ for the same project, which means that they can apply to Creative Engagement and UMEZ Arts Engagement for the same project. And because their project budget for this festival is $20,000, we could consider this organization for the maximum grant amount of $16,000. So that's the quick exercise to help visualize how meeting the different requirements for the different funding sources may help to assess which program you should apply to, considering what project you have in mind, and also what the funding amount you could be looking at. We're going to talk about the project expenses later in the session, but we do want to we hope that through this section, you have a better understanding how also being eligible for multiple funding sources will impact that grant amount that you will be considered for. So that's it for the eligibility requirements for individuals, collectives, and organizations. All of this information is in the program guidelines and in the online application form, so you have access to that information. And we'll send that to you as well in a follow-up email. Now, if after reviewing those materials and after this session, you're still unsure of which funding source you may be eligible for, we encourage you to contact us for further guidance. So closing out this section of the session today, I just want you to take away 3 things. First, that you may be eligible for up to 4 funding sources for the same project. Second, that the more funding sources you're eligible for, the more re-grant funds you can be considered for. And then third, that LMCC will maximize the grant amount you are considered for. So with that, this is all of the information we have for you as in terms of you as an applicant and the requirements that you must meet for each available funding source. In just a moment, Laura is going to talk more about the kinds of projects that we can support through Creative Engagement, CreativeLearning, and UMEZ Arts Engagement. But before we move on, we want to pause for a few questions on the eligibility requirements for applicants. And you can drop questions in the chat, or if you have a question, you can also use the raise hand icon, and we'll try to get through a few questions. If we don't get to your question, don't worry, we will have a dedicated time for questions at the end of the session. So
Hi,
Laura,
Lina.
yes.
There are lots of questions in the chat. I've been trying to answer them as we go along, but I did want to highlight a few that came up a couple times. One question that came up multiple times is, what do you mean by a non-arts education performing arts project?
Yeah, so basically is when we're talking about non-arts education project, means that the ultimate purpose of the project is not about learning experiences for the audience, that the project is really presentation of an artwork, a piece. It could be a choreography, it could be a theater work. If the project, for example, has some workshops with the community as one of like an additional add-on part of the project, that's totally fine, as long as the kind of ultimate presentation to the public is a performance that does not have like a learning experience embedded into it.
Great, thank you, Lina. We also had a few questions come up about 501c3 status in the nonprofit organization eligibility requirements. so I'm going to combine a couple questions that came up into one.
Mhm.
But does 501c3 status extend to collectives with a fiscal sponsor?
Mhm.
And if you have a group that does not yet have 501c3 status, but they do have a fiscal sponsor, can they apply to LMCC with that fiscal sponsor? And does that fiscal sponsor have to be based in Manhattan?
Okay. So for our programs, anyone who has a fiscal sponsor has to apply as an individual or an individual on behalf of a group. That applies to both those of you collectives that have an established fiscal sponsor and will continue working this way. You have to apply as an individual on behalf of a collective. And if you are in the process of getting incorporated either at the federal or state level, but you don't have those that paperwork by the time of the application, submit the proposal as an individual on behalf of a collective. And there was another part of that, Laura, that I missed.
I think like I think you covered it, but a question I think wrapped up in that is like, does the fiscal sponsor have to be based in Manhattan?
Right. That was the other thing. Yeah, the fiscal sponsor does not have to be based in Manhattan. There is one fiscal sponsorship requirement for the UMEZ Arts Engagement Program. For that program, an individual or collective can either apply with a fiscal sponsor that has a formal fiscal sponsorship program, meaning that they have published guidelines for the programs. They have a history of sponsoring other projects. So that's what we mean about a formal fiscal sponsorship. That fiscal sponsor needs to be based in New York City for the UMEZ Arts Engagement Program. But for those individuals who do not have a fiscal sponsor, you can still apply also to UMEZ without a fiscal sponsor. That's totally fine.
Great. Thank you, Lena. There's so many questions. I'm having a hard time picking which one. I'm trying to pick ones that would be relevant to a lot of people in the room. But is there a minimum of projects required for the history of arts programming to access UMEZ funds within that two-year period?
No, we'll just ask you to give us one for each year. So one presentation for, say, 2020 and one presentation for 2024. Those can be virtual or in person. It can be in the city, in the state, or abroad. There's no requirement about the geographic focus of those. And you only need to list them. You don't need to provide any additional information for that.
Great, thank you, Lena. And we do have one hand raised from Heather. We'll take one more question here and then we'll move on to we'll keep going.
Okay.
Heather, would you like to ask your question?
Oh, okay, there we go. Thank you. Yes, I was just wondering, as an individual artist that lives and works in Manhattan, if I don't know yet where I might share the work when it's finished, would I be eligible for city or Gilman funds?
Yeah, that's totally fine. So we do ask for a venue in the application form. That will help the jury understand what's the vision for your project. So think about what's the ideal location for your project. You can list that in the application. If it changes, don't worry. If you are awarded, we'll work with you, next year. But you do need to provide a tentative venue. As long as that venue is in Manhattan and your project is a performing arts project, then yes, you will be eligible for city and Gilman funds.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Lena. Great. Thank you, everyone. I know there are still lots of questions, so please do stick around to the end of the session when we will be facilitating that verbal Q&A. And again, if you have our contact information, so please do email us if we do not get to your question. Great. So at this point, we are going to move on to talk about each individual grant program and their different goals. So I'm going to start talking about creative engagement and UMEZ arts engagement, and then later on in the session, we'll talk about creative learning. So as a reminder, creative engagement and UMEZ arts engagements are two separate programs funded by different agencies. Creative engagement is supported by DCLA, NISCA, and the Howard Gilman Foundation, so City, State, and Howard Gilman. And UMEZ Arts Engagement is supported by the Upper Manhattan Empowerment Zone. However, both UMEZ Arts Engagement and Creative Engagement support similar activities. So both programs provide grants for projects that offer audiences an opportunity to experience, participate in, or attend an artistic event or program of any discipline. All projects must be available to and widely promoted to the general public. And projects supported through creative engagement and UMEZ arts engagement include a wide range of activities, artistic genres, and disciplines. And this includes performances, concerts, film screenings, art exhibitions, public art installations, social practice projects, literary readings, and festivals. And we're always open to new ideas. We also encourage you to reference the past grantee lists available on our website to get a sense of the wide range of arts activities that we support through these programs. And again, projects may include more traditional forms of audience engagement, such as an opportunity to attend a theatrical performance, as well as more innovative forms, such as participatory or socially engaged practices. Now let's talk about the difference between creative engagement and UMEZ arts engagement. So creative engagement supports activities anywhere in the borough of Manhattan, while UMEZ arts engagement supports activities in Upper Manhattan only. But again, they both support the same types of activities. So that's just for the general goals of creative engagement and UMEZ arts engagement. Now let's shift gears and talk about creative learning, which is our arts education for older adults program. And this is already one of the biggest differences. So creative learning provides grants for sequential, skill-based arts education, participatory art making projects in any discipline for older adults anywhere in the borough of Manhattan. And for those of you who are familiar with the creative learning program from past cycles, here are a few shifts that we have made to the program starting this year. Creative learning is no longer supporting arts education programming for youth, adults, or intergenerational audiences. Creative learning will focus solely on arts education for older adults. This shift has been the result of a multi-year evaluation informed by grantees and applicants' feedback when accessing funds through the Creative Learning program. We recognize the increased need for bolstered capacity for teaching artists when delivering community-based arts learning programs, and we also see a rising demand for funding for arts learning programs for older adults, led specifically by teaching artists. Therefore, creative learning will now welcome hands-on learning sessions designed specifically for older adults in any discipline. This can range from traditional art forms such as ceramics and dance to innovative activities like improv and game design. These projects should take place in community-based settings such as libraries, senior centers, or community and recreation centers. And for older adults who are homebound, we also welcome distance learning projects. Now, because creative learning focuses on the depth and progression of learning for the participants, proposed projects must include at least 3 sequential learning sessions between the same teaching artist and a group of participants. And you will demonstrate this in the required lesson plan that you have to submit as part of your work sample. And to highlight the social element that is essential for healthy aging, all proposed projects to Creative Learning are required to include at least one culminating event that involves the participants and the immediate community. This requirement is also new this year. And finally, we learned from our program evaluation that structural support is crucial for the success of a community learning project. Therefore, if you are an individual artist or a collective, we highly encourage you to collaborate with a local senior center or community center as a partner organization to implement your projects. If you do not already have a partner in mind, LMCC is providing a new service this year that will help pair individual artists and collective applicants with a senior center to access state funds through the Creative Learning program. Now, if you are an individual artist or an individual artist applying on behalf of a collective, and you are interested in having LMCC pair you with a partner organization, you must indicate your interest in the application form. So the application form will ask you if you're interested in this service. We will inform you of the pairing once your project has been selected for funding. And finally, related to Creative Learning, teaching artists can now apply in the same fiscal year to both the Creative Learning Grant Program and to the Sukasa program. Applicants can apply to both programs with the same project or with different projects. Keep in mind that if you are awarded in Sukasa and Creative Learning, projects have to be presented separately. And as we mentioned earlier, Sukasa is LMCC's Creative Aging program presented in partnership with DCLA and the City Council. And this program places individual artists or small collectives of 2 members in Manhattan senior centers to carry out learning projects for older adults from January through June 2025. The deadline to apply to both Sukasa and Creative Learning is September 10th, 2024. And if you are interested in learning more about the Sukasa program, we will be offering an information session about this program on Tuesday, July 30th at 6 p.m. via Zoom. So that's for the general goals and considerations for Creative Learning. And now that we've talked about what Creative Engagement, UMEZ Arts Engagement, and Creative Learning can support, let's talk about the kinds of projects LMCC funding is not available for, so our funding restrictions. I'm going to start this next section by talking about the funding restrictions that apply to all 3 grant programs, and then we'll touch on a few specific restrictions for each program at the end. So in general, across all 3 grant programs, LMCC funds cannot support things like unrelated administrative or operating costs. So remember that these are project grants. So all costs need to be connected to you being able to carry out the project. So we cannot support things like startup costs for new organizations, and we cannot support things like capital acquisitions. And because we are trying to get the funds directly to the arts activities that reach or actively engage with the public, we cannot support projects that are designed to be experienced by audiences in private or solo or self-guided without live interaction with the artist. So for example, we cannot support the release of a publication, an app, or a podcast. We also cannot support fellowships, cash prizes, regrants, or residencies without a public component. And we cannot support projects that are restricted to any kind of membership. And finally, we cannot support projects where the art component is not the primary focus. And this includes humanities projects, so things like standalone lectures, historic walking tours, or events that take a more theoretical approach to talk about art, but don't actually present any artistic works to the public. And, oh, sorry, I forgot one. And finally, we cannot support events that are fundraisers or parties. And you can certainly include costs for receptions in your project budget, But if you are awarded, you just cannot LMCC funds towards these kinds of costs. Great, so those are all the funding restrictions that apply to all 3 grant programs. In this next section, I'm going to talk about the funding restrictions that apply to UMEZ Arts Engagement and Creative Engagement only. So this first restriction is mostly for performing arts projects, such as dance and theater. For folks who are presenting work in progress showings that are designed to be only for the development of new work. So this includes presentations to workshop your work and to receive feedback from invited audiences and arts professionals to inform future presentations of the finished work. We ask you to please come to LMCC when you are ready to show the completed work to the public. And for any discipline, do keep in mind that we cannot support the presentation of the same artistic work twice. So if we've supported, let's say, a very specific theater performance through LMCC's programs in the past, we cannot support that same very specific theater performance again in the future. And finally, both Creative Engagement and UMEZ Arts Engagement cannot support education projects. So this includes training or youth programs, arts education, and creative aging projects. And if you are a teaching artist or an organization carrying out arts learning programming for older adults, we recommend that you look into the CreativeLearning program. So those are the funding restrictions for UMEZ Arts Engagement and Creative Engagement. Now let's talk about some specific restrictions for the CreativeLearning program. So as I mentioned earlier, CreativeLearning exclusively supports arts learning activities for older adults in community-based settings. CreativeLearning projects cannot support projects that are designed for youth, adults, or intergenerational participants, as previously supported by the program. Additionally, CreativeLearning cannot support projects with an audition or merit-based selection process to determine who participates. You can design the program for a particular group defined by skill level, neighborhood, interest in a specific art form, etc. But the program must then be widely promoted to the people within this target group, and registration must be on a first come, first served basis. So this means that if someone within your target group finds out about your program, they should be able to attend without going through an interview or auditions or other kind of selection process. And finally, CreativeLearning cannot fund professional arts training programs. So for example, vocal training for professional opera singers or a boot camp for advanced dancers. You can review the list of funding restrictions in the program guidelines. And if you have any questions, please do contact us and we'll provide further guidance. So that's all for the funding restrictions of all the programs. Next, we will talk about the review process. But before we move on, I want to pause for some questions from the chat. And specifically, we will be answering questions about what our funds can and cannot be used for.
Great. Thank you, Laura. We have one question that is about artistic fee, so we'll talk about that later. Keep that in mind. We have a question in the chat about if a project is a performance, can it be presented twice in the same, like within the calendar year, like for different iterations?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you can come to us for the presentation of the same piece within the same calendar year. That restriction is really talking about, like, let's say you were funded for that same presentation in a previous grant cycle, so like 2023. And then let's say that you come back to LMCC to fund that same specific program in 2025, that's when we would not be able to support that programming. But you can do as many presentations as you would like within the calendar year that you are requesting funds for.
Great. Another question. So would a project be considered ineligible for creative engagement if it involves workshops for young people that later leads to a final exhibition or public event?
Great question. I have some follow-up questions, but primarily is as long as there is like a final public presentation for the general public, like that, as long as that final presentation isn't designed for you to receive feedback on that presentation, and then it's kind of closed off only to arts professionals and an invited audience, then that's when we would not be able to support that presentation. But if you're workshopping a program and then the culminating event is an exhibition, and if that exhibition is widely available to and promoted to the public, then that would be eligible for our programs.
I would just add that it's also important to think about what the audience is for that project and the ultimate purpose of the project. So if that is a project that is more meant for the youth participants to learn about an art form or go through any kind of artistic learning experience, to workshops that then ultimately will culminate in a presentation, that project, we would see it as having an education focus. Therefore, it would not be a fit for creative engagement. And so it's important to think about what's the core goal of that project when thinking about whether it will fit or not. But if you have questions, you can always call us. We can talk about the specifics of your project, walk through different questions, and then assess whether, it would be eligible or not. There's also a question about, so educational projects, they have to go through CreativeLearning, but those projects should be only for older adult participants. So that's the main focus of the CreativeLearning program. Okay, let me see. Can you submit more than one proposal for creative engagement?
No, you can only submit one proposal per grant cycle. So if you were to submit two, we would ask you which one you want to move forward for review.
Great. And one more. When a stage reading or a reading presentation would be eligible?
Yeah, so in this case, again, and thinking about what the goal of the presentation is and who the audience is. So yeah, you can certainly have a staged reading as a proposed project. But again, if that staged reading was closed off to only arts professionals to give you feedback, then that would not be eligible. But if you're doing a more scaled down version of the project to present to the general public, then yes, that would be eligible. But keep in mind that in the future, you would not be able to access funds through LMCC for that same project because we have already supported it.
Great. Thank you, Laura. I think, yeah, let's move on, and then we'll cover more questions at the end of the session.
Great. Thanks, Lena. Amazing. So let's talk about the review process. So right now, you know everything that you need to know to be eligible to apply, including the eligibility requirements for each applicant type to access the 4 different sources of funding, the types of projects that Creative Engagement, Creative Learning, and UMEZ Arts Engagement can support, and the funding restrictions for our programs. Now let's talk about how funding decisions are made at LMCC. For the Manhattan Arts Grants, LMCC utilizes a peer review process. This means that LMCC invites an external jury composed of artists and arts professionals actively working in Manhattan for creative engagement and creative learning, or Upper Manhattan specifically for the UMEZ Arts Engagement Program. The jury changes from year to year and is specific to each grant program. The jury is also selected after the application deadline to ensure that it is reflective of the applicant pool. We also place priority on assembling diverse juries whose members reflect a balance of backgrounds and expertise in a variety of areas, including artistic genre and form, racial, ethnic, and cultural background, and knowledge and familiarity of Manhattan neighborhoods and communities. And this process is set up to ensure projects are reviewed based on their merit and ability to address the program criteria, and all of the criteria are weighted equally. Now, if you would like to nominate yourself or someone to be considered for the jury, please use the jury nomination form available on our website. And if you are curious, you can also see the juror list for each program on our website. So this is a great segue into the review criteria for each program. We will start with the Creative Engagement and UMass Arts Engagement review criteria, and then I will speak to the Creative Learning review criteria later on. So remember that Creative Engagement and UMass Arts Engagement are for public-facing arts projects and programming in any discipline. Therefore, the criteria are the same for both programs, but the applications are reviewed in two separate program-specific juries. The Creative Engagement jury and the UMass Arts Engagement jury use the following 4 points of criteria to evaluate all projects. All 4 points of criteria are considered equally. So first, let's talk about the artistic experience, which is taking into consideration the project relevance to the intended audience, the artistic vision, and goals. Second is the clarity of the project proposal, which is demonstrated by the cohesiveness of the application and adequately conveying all elements of the project. The third is project feasibility, which is taking into consideration the production plan, budget, and capacity to achieve the stated goals, including any past experience and/or any planned collaborations you may have. And fourth is the appropriateness of the outreach and marketing plans, which is demonstrated by an explicit understanding of your intended audience, your relevant networks, and any strategies you may use to reach your intended audience. Okay, so that's the criteria for Creative Engagement and UMass Arts Engagement. Now let's talk about Creative Learning. And as a reminder, Creative Learning is for arts learning projects in community-based settings, specifically for older adults. Creative Learning also has 4 points of criteria. The first is the artistic learning experience, which takes into consideration the learning goals, the teaching methodology, the depth of the creative process for participating older adults, and the proposed teaching artists. The second point of criteria is the project feasibility, which takes into consideration the proposed timeline, past relevant experience of the proposed teaching artists, and the stated learning goals. And third is the clarity and detail in the project proposal, which is demonstrated by the cohesiveness of the application and adequately conveying all elements of the project. And finally, is the fourth point of criteria, which is the potential impact on participating older adults, which is demonstrated by the outreach and recruitment strategies, learning and physical accessibility strategies, programmatic accommodations, and social engagement goals for the older adult participants. So those are the 4 points of criteria for Creative Learning. And same as in Creative Engagement and UMass Arts Engagement, all criteria are weighted equally. So there is no criteria point that is more important than another. And as you're completing your applications, make sure to compare your application materials to the 4 points of criteria of the program you're applying to ensure that your application as a whole is addressing each of the criteria. Yeah, so basically just make sure that your application is giving the jury all the information they would need to be able to envision your project. And this includes the artistic experiences for the public, who is involved in carrying out the project, your plan to execute the project as proposed, talk about who the audience is or the participants that you want to reach, And make sure to mention any strategies you will use to ensure the participation of your intended audience or intended participants. And make sure to include any existing networks or partners who will help you. One thing to keep in mind if you are applying to UMEZ Arts Engagement and Creative Engagement is to make sure that you highlight any existing networks or intended partners, specifically in Upper Manhattan, in addition to your Manhattan-wide networks and efforts. And LMCC staff has also put together a document that outlines the 4 points of criteria of the programs, along with some staff tips and considerations that you can reference as you prepare your application. The staff tips and recommendations document will be sent to you in our follow-up email, and it is also linked in the application form itself. So this wraps the review process and the timeline for Creative Engagement, Creative Learning, and UMEZ Arts Engagement. And now Lena is going to talk about the online application form and the timeline to hear back.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, great. Thank you. Great. Yes. So we're like in the final stretch of the sessions. We'll have plenty of time for more questions. But for now, I want to talk about, at this point, you know which funding sources you're eligible for, which program is the best for you and your project. So the next step would be, applying, meaning that you will need to start working on your online application form. That application must be submitted through the Submittable portal, so submittable.com. So let's talk about the online application forms. Creative Engagement and UMEZ Arts Engagement have the same application form, which you can use to apply to both programs for the same project. Now, Creative Learning has a separate application form, but all forms are structured in the same way. So regardless of the program that you're applying for, you will notice that the application form is split into 2 parts. We have part 1, which is the project proposal. So this is all of the information related to the project. That includes the narrative questions, the project budget, work samples, support materials, and organization's financial information if applicable. So this is the section that the jury will use to review your proposal based on the criteria that Laura just shared. Now, part 2 of the application form is the applicant profile. So in this section, you're going to include all the information about you as an applicant. So that will include your proof of address or nonprofit organization status proof, and any other required materials for an organization or a fiscal sponsor if applicable. Now, this is the section that LMCC staff will use to determine your eligibility as an applicant for the programs. Now, as you start working on your application, it's important that at the top of the application, you answer the questions about applicant type, as well as the funding sources you are requesting, because that will reveal the relevant sections for you as an applicant and the funding sources that you need. So make sure that you fill these questions first, and then you see all the pieces of information that you will need to provide. For the narrative questions, there is a word limit, so keep that in mind as you draft your responses, especially if you're going to work offline to then copy and paste. So keep an eye out for those word limits. And then also, we do have step-by-step instructions and guidance for how to complete each section of the application form. So keep an eye out for those prompts and instructions. We won't be looking at the complete form today, but the areas that we often get the most questions about are project budget and work samples. So I'm going to focus on these 2 components of your applications. So starting with the project budget. So in this section of your application, you will find a table for your project cash expenses and also 2 narrative questions for your cash income and in-kind resources. Now, for the project cash expenses table, which you can see in the screens, you'll have to enter all possible cash expenses connected to producing and presenting the proposed project to the public. That should be for the Manhattan activities for CreativeEngagement and CreativeLearning, or Upper Manhattan activities for UMEZ Arts Engagement. All of these expenses should be incurred during the grant period, so between January 1st and December 31st of 2025. You will notice that we have many different categories for you to choose from, but you only need to fill out those that are applicable to you. As part of those expenses, expense categories, you can find administrative or production costs. But again, all of those should be connected to realizing the proposed project with an emphasis on the public presentation. So looking at the administrative costs, that could include things such as a space rental, equipment rental, marketing and promotion costs, licenses, office supplies, insurance, any of those costs connected to the project that you're proposing. Your project may also include artistic personnel costs, which could be, would be the fees for the artists that are involved in the project, either for presenting their work or that will be involved in helping you produce and present the project that you are proposing. LMCC is committed to the payment of artists, so we do require that all participating artists be paid a fee. So you have to demonstrate that in your project budgets. We do not dictate the amount, as we understand people are working at different scales, different disciplines. So the fee, the amount, that's up to you, but we do require that you include a fee for all of the artists that are part of your project. And that also applies for you as individual artists applying for your own work. You also need to include an artistic fee for yourself. Now, as you complete the project budget, you'll see that there is a description column in the middle. So this is where you're going to give the details for each line item that you're going to use. So for example, for the artistic personnel line and the artistic fees, here you can describe how many artists are going to be part of the project and what are their pay rates. That would then help for the jury to understand the math behind your budget, and then also to see how this is going to be complementing the narrative of the project. Now, as you input the expenses in the amounts column, which is on the far right, you will enter the amount for each budget line item that you're going to use. It's important that you do not use the $ as you enter the numbers. Otherwise, the template will not calculate the information correctly. Because at the bottom of this table, you'll see that we have a total cash expense line. That means that the budget is going to be auto-calculating all of the different amounts that you're going to be inputting to give you a total project cash expense amount. And that total cash expense amount is the one that LMCC staff will use to determine the grant amount you will be considered for, again, depending on the funding sources that you are eligible for. So as you fill out the cash expense table, keep in mind a couple of things. Focus on providing a realistic budget that is reflective of the narrative in your application. Make sure that you're going to include all the tentative expenses for your project. Again, that could be connected to planning or designing and producing, presenting the project to the public, as long as all of those expenses are going to be within 2025 and in Manhattan. For anyone who's applying with a citywide project, you would need to focus your application, the narrative, on the Manhattan activities, and your budget should also reflect the Manhattan activities. Now, make sure that the total amount of your project is no less than $4,000, because LMCC will not award grants below 4,000. That's the minimum award amount. So that's for the project budget. Along the project budget, there are going to be 2 narrative questions in the application form. And these are meant to provide complementary information about your project's financials. One is the project cash income question, which will ask you to provide confirmed and or potential sources of funding for your project, as well as any additional fundraising efforts that you will pursue in support of your proposed project. And again, that can be confirmed or tentative. You will also find a narrative question for the in-kind resources that you may be pursuing or you are receiving. Those are confirmed, that will be in support of your project. So alongside these questions and the expenses, that's how you are going to communicate to the jury the financial scope of the project, both on the expenses and also on the different ideas that you have to fund the project that you are proposing. LMCC does not require a match for these programs, meaning that if your project, for example, is $4,000, right, and you're eligible for one funding source and you're recommended for funding by the jury, LMCC would potentially issue a $4,000 grant to cover all of the expenses. So there's no requirement, no percentage of the maximum that we can cover of a project budget, but just keep in mind the set grant amounts that we have based on who you are and what funding sources you are eligible for. So that's a quick overview of the project budget. In the follow-up email, we will also share some resources to help you prepare an effective project budget. So that will, come soon. And we'll have some more time at the end for questions about this. I want to share now a bit of information on work samples, and then I'll walk us through the timeline to hear back, and we'll be ending the session very soon. But talking about work samples. So the purpose of work samples is to bring the jury as close as possible to an actual experience of your proposed work. So you want to make sure that your work samples show your artistic interest for creative engagement and UMEZ arts engagement, and your vision for the older adult participants' learning experience for creative learning. You can select different formats for your work samples between audio or video recordings, images, or manuscripts. But one key difference in work sample formats between all programs is that for creative learning, all applicants are required to provide a lesson plan in addition to work samples. On the screen, you will see the work sample format options for creative engagement and UMEZ arts engagement, as well as for creative learning. But you can find these on the program guidelines and application form. And we also provide further guidance based on the artistic discipline in the guidelines. So make sure that you review that after tonight. For creative engagement and UMEZ arts engagement, keep in mind that these grants are for the presentation of the work. So you want to make sure that you are submitting a sample of a project that is connected to what you're proposing. It could be a sample of a past completed work of similar scope to what you're proposing. If you're applying with a project that you have already presented, it could be a sample of that past presentation. Or if you are applying with a new project for which you don't have a work sample yet, you can provide renderings or sketches of that project. Now for creative learning. So for creative learning, we strongly encourage applicants to submit education-based work samples of the proposed teaching artists. So that will be documentation of classroom work or samples of participants' work that demonstrate your ability as a teaching artist or of the teaching artist in the project. Now, also for creative learning, keep in mind that the purpose of the lesson plan is to show the jury the structure of your proposed project, as well as your planned activities and teaching style. As the requirement for creative learning is that you show at least 3 sequential sessions between the teaching artist and the group of participants, please make sure that your lesson plan shows at least 3 sequential contact sessions. We do have a template for the lesson plan that you'll find in the application form, and we'll also be sharing that in the follow-up email. So these are just some very brief general recommendations around work samples and lesson plan. But again, all of this information and further information can be found in the program guidelines. So now that we've talked about online application form, budgets, and work samples, I'll just share the application timeline, and then we're going to go into some more questions and answers. So the first thing to remember is that the application deadline is Tuesday, September 10 by 5 p.m. After the application deadline, LMCC staff will review all of the applications for eligibility and completeness. Only eligible and complete applications will move forward to be reviewed by the external jury panel that Laura talked about earlier today. The jury will convene to evaluate and make funding recommendations in January. After the jury meeting is complete, we will have a board approval process, which helps to assess staff protocols from the launch of the programs to the jury meetings are held to the highest level of integrity. So the board approval process will not change any of the funding determinations that the jury made. After all of these steps, applicants will hear back in March whether or not they were funded. Please note that projects taking place between January and March are eligible to apply, but you won't hear back from us about your application until March. So keep that in mind in your planning if your project is between January and March. Now, after we have notified all applicants, we will send grantee contracts in April. And because we have to go through all of these steps, we are likely sending checks in May, but that also depends on when LMCC receives the re-grant funds from our 4 funding agencies. We're always trying to streamline this process and get notifications and payment out sooner, but currently this is the timeline that we're working with, and we want to make sure that you are aware of it. And with that, we're going to wrap up today. So you have all of the information now about creative engagement, UMEZ engagement, and creative learning. Program guidelines are available to you, as well as the online application form. Make sure that you review and get well acquainted with those materials. As you start working on your applications, do contact us if you have any questions. You have our contact information in the screen, and again, we'll send you a follow-up email. We will also offer more in-depth guidance on in-progress applications during our virtual office hours and application labs, which there will be more information about. You can also find all of this on the website lmcc.net/RSVP. A recording of today's session will also be available in the coming weeks. That may not come in the follow-up email, but it will be available very soon, and we'll notify you once the recording is available. Now, one last time, the application deadline is Tuesday, September 10 by 5 p.m. So with that, I want to thank you all for joining us today.